Hello. Alright, so this is gonna be another one of those LXD release feature review and demo. So we released LXD 4.14 just yesterday evening, and it's currently available in the latest candidate channel for those who want to try it there, and we expect it to roll out to the stable channel on Monday or Tuesday. We're currently tracking, I think, one minor issue with this release in one of the new features, so we're going to be fixing that very shortly. But otherwise, everything looks good so far. So, what's new in LXD 4.14? So this is the release announcement. I'll just go through kind of the highlights and then try and do demos for each of those. So the first feature we've got on that list is the support for ACLs on managed bridges. You may remember me introducing network ACLs over the past couple of releases, and now we've got them also for normal bridges. There are quite a few limitations. Normal Linux bridges are not as flexible as other networks, so that comes with a few caveats and kind of restrictions there. The main restriction is that you don't actually get per port ACL. So all of the only ACLs you can use on a managed bridge are going to be ingress and egress of the bridge itself. So you get to firewall what all of your instances can connect to and what can reach your instances. You don't get to control any instance-to-instance traffic within the same bridge. It's something that we've looked at doing, at supporting on normal bridges too. It's just very tricky. The Linux kernel APIs for this particular feature are not super consistent. They're also a bit restricted, and we definitely couldn't get something that would work properly with both NF tables and X tables. So we instead decided to go with the common denominator as far as what we would support, and just go with only supporting ACLs, so ingress and egress ACLs on the bridge itself. Then we've got cluster member certificates. So this is mostly an internal change. Up until now, LXD cluster members would communicate with each other over the LXD API by using the cluster certificate itself as the client certificate, and that's how we were handling authentication. The per server certificate was only used once you would remove a machine from the cluster. That worked fine. The main issue was that once you would remove a cluster member from the cluster, potentially forcefully, they would still be allowed to connect to the cluster because they still had that cluster certificate around. So we changed that a bit now, and instead we make sure that every single cluster member has a standalone server certificate, either dating back from when they were on standalone node or just generated at the same time they joined the cluster. And we then use that cluster certificate, that server certificate, as the client certificate for communications within the cluster. So that means that each of your cluster member now has an entry in the LXD trust store, and when a cluster member is removed, that entry goes away. The cluster, that previous cluster member is no longer capable of connecting to the LXD cluster in any way. So it's a bit of an improvement on security, especially for machines that were decommissioned and not properly wiped or that kind of stuff. It doesn't change anything for the client. The client still gets the normal cluster-wide certificate, and as far as what they communicate to. Then a tiny change, we've added support for descriptions on cluster members. So now if you do cluster list, there's a new description field that you can populate with whatever you want. It's very similar to what we've got on just about every single object in LXD. We actually had that field already in the database, we just never exposed it for some reason. So I've recently fixed APIs to expose that field, allow modifying it, and now LXD cluster list shows it, and LXD cluster edit lets you change it. Another cluster feature we have is token-based join. So up until now, when you were joining a machine to a cluster, you can have two ways to go about it. Either you would take its server certificate, transfer that manually to one of the cluster members, and then do cluster config LXD config trust add to manually add that certificate into the trust store. Or you would do what most people were doing, which is you set the trust password on the entire cluster, and then you join by entering that trust password and just looking at the fingerprint of the server and being, yeah, fine, that looks correct. That's never been really ideal because nobody realistically looks at the fingerprint and makes sure that it's safe. And having a password that anyone who gets their hands on it can get full access to LXD is also not ideal. So what we've done instead now is you can do LXD cluster add, and that will generate a join token. So you need to pass it the name of the machine that you're going to be adding, in this case VMO2, and then you get a join token, which is a big string, which is effectively base64. And what's in that string is a one-time use secret for joining the cluster that will only allow that one machine to join as the name that's been specified. They can't go and pretend to be anything else. It also includes all of the IP addresses of the cluster endpoints, and it includes the server certificate of the cluster. So that way it means we don't need to do the fingerprint prompt anymore. There's no chance for anyone to do man in the middle or anything, and there's no more trust password that's set globally. You can still use that mechanism if you want to, but this new mechanism is far safer. Then we've added support for server warnings. So that's just the ability to have LXD record a persistent warning, also potentially cluster-wide, and have the CLI easily access those warnings and acknowledge them or delete them. That's quite an improvement over the old way of doing things, which was just logging an entry in a log file, and that would usually go unnoticed unless something really wrong was going on and the user would go look at it. Now with that endpoint, it's very easy for someone to go and add that to a monitoring system and get an alert whenever something new showed up in there. And they can also be silenced, as I mentioned, by acknowledging them. We've added new project restrictions to restrict snapshots and backups within projects. And we've also been adding support for user.whatever config keys now inside of devices, which we believe is the only place left within the LXD API that didn't support arbitrary key value for use by third-party tools. And it's been a bit of a recurring thing for the past few releases, but we've extended the Swagger REST API coverage. Now I'm getting pretty close to the end. We're more than halfway done with the instances API endpoints. That should be probably done next week, and then we just need to do storage and we'll be done. So definitely looking forward to having our entire API covered by that automatically generated documentation and be able to retire the old documentation. All right, so that was just kind of me going through the features. Let's now just do this again with some examples. Keep in mind that some of those I've not actually tried yet. It's been quite a busy week for me, and I've not actually gotten to test everything. So hopefully we're not gonna see any major issue with my test systems, but it's definitely possible. So let me just switch over to a terminal here. And the first one would be around the ACL feature. So just make sure I'm using my local system first. Let's look at the instances. Okay. So I don't think I've got anything particularly fancy here. Yeah, I just have one standard bridge called XDBR0. It's got a different search domain. That's the only thing that's weird with it. So if I go in one of the containers, let's see if I can just ping Google DNS. Yep. All right, let's see if we can't block that without blocking anything else. So actually I do have a test ACL. Well, let's delete it and just create it again. So let's create a test ACL. And then in that ACL, just call it block Google DNS. So we don't actually want to do anything bad to ingress, so we're just gonna allow everything. That should do it. But egress, we also want to technically allow everything but we're gonna have also a deny. State enabled, and destination would be actually it's reject. I think that I want here. Okay, so far so good. So now we're gonna be trying to set on LXD-BR0 security.acls test. Okay, so that worked. Now let's see if it does what we want it to do. So that still works. Does this still work? Does not. All right, so that's it. Like you now have an ACL applied on LXD-BR0. Just as a reminder, yeah, that ACL rejects all traffic going to 888, allows everything else. And yeah, that was just fine. Obviously, you can do things that are quite a bit more useful. As I mentioned earlier, we don't have the same port-based ACL mechanism than we do for Oven, so you can't like use different ACLs on specific instances and then do things like, if you're coming from a database instance, allow this kind of traffic. Instead, you're going to have to do network-wide ACLs and then do IP address-based source or destination filtering here to actually apply to the instances you want. So it's very similar to you running, IP tables on your system. The advantage is that it's all within LXD using the LXD API, so it might be easier for you to directly put in place. Okay, let me just undo this, otherwise I'm gonna get very confused later on if I forgot that I put an ACL in place. I'm just gonna delete it. Next up is the cluster member certificates. There's really not much I can show there. The only thing I guess I can show is if I connect to one of my production cluster servers, I can just show you the different files on disks. For anyone who's wondering, our SSH is just a wrapper that does root after your SSH, just a wrapper around sudo. Alright, so if I go in my LXD main folder, we can see we've got cluster CRT and server CRT. In the past, we had on the initial node, cluster CRT would be a symlink to server CRT, which was obviously not ideal. And then the following nodes had distinct files, but they never used server CRT for anything. So we fixed that now. They all have distinct server and cluster. Cluster is global, so it's the same on every single node. That's what's used to answer API queries. And then server is what's used by the server itself to communicate to other servers within the cluster. I don't actually remember if we see the certificates inside certificate list. The certificate list doesn't exist, sorry, it's trust list. Yeah, so we do see them. So as you can see here, I've got a couple of Ansible instances that are trusted to do stuff on the cluster, but we also have now 3 entries that I didn't used to have until they upgraded to 4.14, which are Abydos, Aurora, and Angara, which are the actual 3 servers in my cluster. We don't see too many details here because it's trust list is not really meant to show that kind of internals, but hopefully we can through the lower level API. If I don't make any typos, okay. I guess recursion equals 1. Yeah, there we go. So this time we actually do see it. We can see that some certificates are marked as type server, some others are marked as type client. Those that are type server are the ones used for internal communication, whereas the rest are just client certificates that are allowed to talk to the cluster. So that's that particular feature. Then we've got cluster description. Actually, I probably showed it kind of by accident earlier. If I just switch to my cluster, we can see I'm actually using descriptions here to just mention like physically in the rack which server is which. But it can also be used, like you could use it if it's like in the cloud to track exactly like what region or easy those are in. You could also use that to, I don't know, track the specific hardware you've got in the server, that kind of stuff. So it's another field that you can just go and edit with cluster edit. It's right here, so you can go and change it. All right. Then we've got the cluster token based join. That's the feature that's currently broken. We're actively working on fixing it. It will be fixed by Monday. Basically, the idea is you can now do LXD cluster add followed by a name. So say VMO2, and you get that token. We can probably actually unpack what's in that token to show you. Yeah, there you go. So if we decode the token, we can see it tells the joining node what name it's going to be joining with, the fingerprint of the cluster it's joining so that it can validate there's no one in the middle, it's in talking to the right thing, the addresses of the different cluster nodes. In this case, I only have one, so at this point, so it's effectively taken from cluster list, like it's this value. If you've got multiple cluster members, it will be the list of all of them so that the joining node can try each of them in sequence until it finds one that works. And then that secret is a one-time secret that can be used to join the cluster, and that invalidates itself immediately afterwards. So that lets you join the cluster without having a trust password set. You can also list the current valid tokens. So in this case, I've actually issued 2 for the same system apparently. But yeah, you can list them easily enough. The demo part I would have done is to actually join a node using that token, but there's currently a bit of a race condition during the joining process that makes this work fine if you're using a pre-seed, but not so much if you use the interactive join. So that's what we're fixing right now. All right, next feature is server warnings. So let's see, I should actually have stayed on that server because it probably has a warning. So there's a new command now that's called LXD warning. That's got acknowledge, which can be shortened to ACK, delete, list, and show. If you do warning list, it will show you warnings within your cluster. So in this case, it's just on that one machine. I've got 2 warnings. One is that the block.io wait controller is not available. The other one is that the memory swap accounting is not enabled on the system. You can keep them as they are, and they will keep showing, telling you that that's something you probably will want to improve. Or you can, if you don't, like if it's normal, if it's expected behavior, and you just don't want to see those keep alerting, you can acknowledge them. So I can do ACK on the first one. Then if I list, it's gone. I can do list-a, which will then show it again, with this time the status showed as acknowledged. And that's pretty much it for warnings. They are global on a cluster. So currently location A is empty, but it could show you the individual nodes when it's related to a specific cluster. Warning can also be tied directly to things like an instance or storage volume or different resources, so that we can show the same warning multiple times and actually tell you this instance needs some reconfiguration. Currently, the only warnings we've put in place are C groups, where we do intend to roll that out to a lot more things in the future, especially as we see that kind of what people keep running into as far as problems and misconfigurations. We'll try and make sure that those are proper warnings exposed in our API. Okay. The next feature is backup and snapshot project restrictions. So let's switch. I don't remember if I must see on my cluster. I probably am. So I can show you a project here. Yeah, let's increase the font size a bit again. There we go. So this particular project here is using the new feature. So I've got the snapshots are allowed, the backups will not be allowed. So that means that I can still do LXD snapshots just fine on those instances, but I will not be allowed to do export or use the backup API. Should be able to actually demo that looking at the instances. So if I do a snapshot on, let's take Nginx 001 here. Okay, So that worked just fine. Actually, just need to figure out what the name is so I can remove it, since that is... We didn't actually mean to keep that one around, so okay, it's gone. But if the project wasn't configured for that, deny. Sorry, not deny, block. There we go. Then the same should just be rejected. There we go. Doesn't allow for snapshot creation. So those are two extra knobs that can be quite useful. As we mentioned in the release announcement, snapshots can be expensive, especially if you're using like the directory backend. So in those cases, you may not want to allow them. They could also cause for like extra space usage than what's normally allowed for the project. So similarly, you might want to disable them in those cases. The backups are actually quite a bit worse in that they also use a lot of CPU to actually generate, because you need to get the entire instance and potentially all of its snapshots, read all of that data, and then compress it into dump it into a tarball and compress that tarball, and then that space that's used outside of the instance itself. So backups are a great tool, but you probably may not want to allow that in a very space constrained environment where, especially if you've got somewhat interested users using that particular project. In this case, it's worth noting that I can change those project restrictions because I'm a global admin. But if I was using credentials that are just limited to that one project, I would not be able to bypass restrictions quite so easily by just modifying the configuration. All right, and last main feature is the ability to configure, to add config directly onto devices. So if I switch to my local system and we look at C group 2. Okay, so this is a VM I've got. We can actually see here that I've got one of those already configured, but let's just go and clear it. So device and set C group 2 root, and the key is called user.foo. So let's clear that. Okay, so yeah, now we've got the ability to go and set config keys. In this case, just call it ABC and set it to DEF, and that works. You can do that on any devices. So that part was missing. In the past, you could go and set user.type keys directly inside the config. That was just fine. And you could do the same thing on the server itself, on profiles, on networks, on just about anything else in LXD, but not on devices. So we've closed that tiny gap now. That might be useful to store some extra metadata directly on the device, especially if you're thinking like a GPU. Just the PCI address might not be super clear as to what it is, so you could leave some extra metadata directly on it to know exactly what it is or what it's used for. And that's pretty much it as far as the new features in this release. The last item, and we've had that in the past, is the just the Swagger REST API documentation coverage. This time around, what we added is a bunch of the instances endpoints, so all of those here are new. They don't cover everything already, but it's more than half of the instances endpoints being covered. Then the only parts that's going to be missing is going to be storage, which, as you can see, is currently missing here. We did, for all of the new features we've been landing, we've been directly adding support in Swagger as part of those features. That's why you can see warnings are already covered. And the same with network ACLs here that also are covered already. So moving forward, that's simply going to be the only way we document our REST API. It's just building the infrastructure for it has been pretty easy. Actually going through every single endpoint in our code base and every single struct and everything to properly label them and export them, that's been a bit of a time-consuming process over the past little while. And just before wrapping up, the last thing I just wanted to mention is that the LXD team has been hiring for a little while. We've got this forum post up for since end of February pretty much, and we had a total of I think 5 positions open. So we had like 1 technical writer, which we've now filled, 2 software engineers focused on Go REST API type development. One of them has been filled. We're still looking for another one. not a software engineer position, but more focused towards DevOps type work. This has been filled, and there's also a product manager position which is still open. The main one I'm hiring for right now is the software engineer Go position. We are looking for someone with about 2 to 3 years Go experience, especially around implementing REST API servers and clients. Ideally a bit of database knowledge, but our database use is pretty simple. Like it's SQLite effectively, so no super complex server side queries or anything. The role we're looking for folks in Americas or Europe. That's just because of time zones. We're looking for something that's compatible with the rest of the LXD team, and this is all to like improve LXD scalability. We like LXD clusters. They're great. We want more people to be able to use them. We want them to be more reliable, faster, and also being able to scale past the current size of a LXD cluster. So if you're interested, or if you know someone who might be, please send them a link, either directly to the application link here in Greenhouse, or our forum where you can find this role. It's also worth noting we do have a jobs section on the forum. Currently, this is the only post in it, but if you're hiring anyone really that's related to like LXC, LXD, LXCFS, or any of our projects, and you want to put a link to your opening, you can definitely do that. I believe this section is moderated, but that's fine. You just send your post. We'll just make sure that it looks good, and then we'll publish it for you. And that's it for this live stream. That was all of the features in LXD 4.14. Again, we've got one tiny issue we're currently working on that should be resolved shortly, and we'll be in good shape for pushing that to stable users on Monday. If you want to try it until then, the only thing that's currently broken is the LXC cluster join with token. So long as that's not the thing you're trying, you should be all fine using the candidate channel to get 4.14 already. And yeah, thank you very much for watching this. Again, we're hoping that in the near future we get to do live streams about something other than just our releases. We would definitely like to get some of our users on streams, or go through more interesting use cases of what you can do with LXD. But that's gonna be definitely time permitting, and currently we've been quite busy between working on new features and also all of the hiring we've been doing. All right, well, thanks very much for watching, and see you in the next one. Bye.